Thank you. I'm very happy to be here and to be able to share with all of you some aspects of my understanding of my grandfather's philosophy. I was brought up in South Africa. That's where my parents lived and continued with grandfather's work for many years. And so my two sisters and I were born there, and we were brought up there. But at the age of 12, I was taken to India and given the opportunity to live with grandfather and hopefully learn some things from him. And some of the lessons that he taught me at the time really made a tremendous impact on me. I wish I could tell you all the lessons today, but that would require several hours to do. But I'll share with you one particular lesson that made a big impact on me in the sense that it gave me insight into the depth and the breadth of his philosophy of nonviolence. And this happened one day when I was coming back from school, and I had a little notebook and a little pencil in my hands. And I just happened to look at the pencil. It was about 3 inches long. And I thought to myself, I deserve a better pencil. This is too small for me to use. And so without a second thought, I just threw that pencil away because I was so sure that grandfather would give me a new pencil when I asked him for one. But that evening when I met grandfather and asked him for a new pencil, instead of giving me one, he subjected me to a lot of questions. He wanted to know how the pencil became small and where did I throw it away and why did I throw it away, and on and on and on. And I couldn't understand why he was making such a fuss over a little pencil until he told me to go out and look for it. And I said, "You must be joking." He said, "You don't expect me to look for a little pencil in the dark?" He said, "Oh, yes, I do. Here's a flashlight." And he gave me a flashlight and sent me out to look for this pencil, and I must have spent about 2 hours searching for it. And when I finally found it and brought it to him, he said, "Now I want you to sit here and learn 2 very important lessons." The first lesson is that even in the making of a simple thing like a pencil, we use a lot of the world's natural resources, and when we throw them away, we are throwing away the world's natural resources, and that is violence against nature. And the second lesson is that because in an affluent society we can afford to buy all these things in bulk, we overconsume the resources of the world. And because we overconsume them, we are depriving people elsewhere of these resources, and they have to live in poverty. And that is violence against humanity. And that was the first time I realized that all of these little things that we do every day, consciously and unconsciously, things that we throw away and overconsume and waste, and all the time, it's become so much a second nature with us that we are doing this unconsciously. That every time we indulge in any of those acts, we are indulging in some form of violence. And then to make this lesson properly understood, he made me draw a genealogical tree of violence on the same principles as a family tree, with violence as the grandparent and physical violence and passive violence as the 2 branches. And every day before I went to bed, I had to analyze and examine everything that I experienced during the day. Things that I may have done to people or people may have done to me or whatever it was, all of that had to be analyzed and examined and put in their appropriate places on that. If it was the kind of violence where physical force is used, then it would go under physical violence. Things like kicking and slapping and punching and beating up people and murders and rapes and wars and killings and all of these things that we do in our lives, all that would be physical violence then. But if it was the kind of violence where we don't use any physical force, and yet we hurt people, directly or indirectly, consciously or unconsciously, that would be passive violence. And that would be things like discrimination, oppression, suppression, economic, political, social, cultural, religious, all of these things that we do to one another, consciously and unconsciously, that is passive violence. The way I had to determine whether this was passive violence or not was to ask myself the simple question: if somebody were to do this to me, would I be hurt by it or would I be helped by it? And if I came to the conclusion that I would be hurt by it, then that would be passive violence. And when I began to do this introspection, it was a form of introspection, finding out my own weaknesses. I was amazed that within a few months I was able to fill up the whole wall in my room with acts of passive violence. And that is when I became aware of how much passive violence I was committing. And then grandfather explained to me the connection between the two. He said, we commit passive violence all the time, every day, consciously and unconsciously, and that generates anger in the victim. And the victim then resorts to physical violence to get justice, because that's what justice has come to mean today. We are always told that we have to make somebody pay for what they have done, otherwise there's no justice there. So justice is revenge, and that is why people resort to physical violence, because they are the victims of our passive violence. So it is the passive violence that we commit consciously and unconsciously every day that is the fuel that ignites the physical violence. So logically, if we want to put out the fire of physical violence, we have to cut off the fuel supply. And since the fuel supply comes from each one of us, we have to become the change that we wish to see in the world. That is how my grandfather looked at it. And he himself practiced it. And this is unfortunately something that scholars today have either ignored purposely or have not looked deeply enough into his philosophy. They look at Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolence as a way of conflict resolution. And it was not that alone. I have found through my experience and my understanding that it was about personal transformation. That he continuously, all his life, right up to his death, every day, consciously attempted to transform himself to become a better human being. And he told me also during the time I lived with him that every morning when you get up, he says, the first thing that you need to do is to make a conscious attempt and say to yourself that today I am going to be a better human being than I was yesterday. And work towards becoming a better human being. And that is how we conquer the weaknesses that we have within ourselves and turn those weaknesses into strengths. That is how he became a great soul. He was from an ordinary family and a regular family. It was nothing special about the way he was brought up or anything, but he made that conscious effort, and he wanted everybody to know that it is something that all of us can do, reach to some extent to the position that he did.